A very good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Indian Council of World Affairs. We have joined together on the second day of the two-day international seminar themed celebrating 75 years of India's foreign policy. We will start with our fifth session themed India and the Global Order, Setting the Narrative. The session will be chaired by Ambassador Pankaj Saran, former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, former Ambassador to Russia, and former High Commissioner to Bangladesh. The distinguished panelists in the session are Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain, Chancellor, Central University of Kashmir, Lieutenant General Vinod Khandare, Advisor, Ministry of Defence, Government of India, and Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, Adjunct Fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I would request the chair to kindly conduct the proceedings, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Jyoti, for inviting me to this event. I believe we can maybe begin straight away. The panelists are very renowned and distinguished and really do not need any introduction, and we look forward to hearing from them. I will just make a few opening remarks to set the stage and then invite the panelists. When you talk about the global narrative and India, I think one of the first things to understand is who we are in terms of a nation, and we already are the largest country in the world in terms of population, and this has huge geopolitical implications. In the last few years, India has begun to assert itself on the global stage much more than it has done in the past. And this is on account of various factors, including our economic performance, internal political stability, and India's ability to withstand strategic shocks and our self confidence. But there are two lessons we have learned from the crises of the past. One is the inadequacy of global institutions and the post World War II global order to either anticipate or to respond to global crises. And the second lesson is the lack of ownership, if I can use that term, of the world's problems, or in other words, the lack of global leadership. The world seems to be in a state of drift with more uncertainties and negativities than hope. So I feel that both the above facts have opened a window for India to step onto the world stage and play its part in filling what appears to be a strategic and an intellectual deficit. In fact, even a moral deficit. But the real, but the real question is whether India's greater visibility and voice in global councils and on global issues is only a reaction to what is happening elsewhere, or does it represent something far deeper and enduring? I'm sure the panelists would talk about this, and we would reach some conclusions on this point. However, most observers would agree that the answer to the question is the latter, and that really is the big story of our times. India's words, our deeds, and our actions, to my mind, point to three behavioral changes in our approach. The first is the willingness to speak and act. So that is important. You must be willing to do certain things. The second is the confidence that we have displayed in our ability and our capabilities to conduct ourselves in a certain way. And the third change I find is the renewed faith in our values and our heritage and what India brings to the table. Overall, I would say it appears to me that India is emerging from what I would call its strategic hesitancy. It is definitely less apologetic about its national security imperatives. It is also asserting its uniqueness. It is exhibiting pride in its history and civilization, and also offering a point of view and solutions which are practical and, more importantly, which are finding resonance. India is also not just doing what I have described, but it's also a demandeur in the sense that it is demanding that issues of importance to the vast section of humanity are not brushed aside by major powers or by the established powers, and that the current international order and institutions if we feel they are inadequate or they are flawed, must be reformed. Overall, to my mind, this represents a new, bolder approach to international relations, and it is likely that this approach is going to gather momentum in the years ahead. But what gives me optimism also is the fact that indeed this is what the world increasingly is expecting from India. But I will just conclude by saying that to achieve genuine and long lasting success, we also must ensure that we avoid strategic overreach, that we be calm, we be diligent, and we be thorough in our analysis and avoid pitfalls. We have to be constantly aware of what our national goals are and what our capabilities are and never lose sight of them. So, these are just some of my initial thoughts before I request the panelists to share their more insightful and detailed comments. So, I would now like to request Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain for his remarks. And as we discussed, maybe about 10 minutes each, and then we proceed to the next speaker. So, General Hasnain, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran. In fact, I wish we could just continue to listen to you because you were so erudite and so correct in your entire analysis of what is really needed. I shall speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. This is what is the thing broadly laid out. And I'll ensure that I stop exactly at that so that we have enough time for everyone to cover their portion. Fellow panelists, esteemed members, thank you, ICWA, for inviting me for this event. I'm really honored. Prescriptively, the world order refers to a preferred arrangement of power and authority that is associated with the realization of such values as peace, economic growth and equity, human rights and environmental security, and equality and sustainability. The role a nation plays in such an order is contingent on its strategic confidence, experience, and aspirations. Ideally, a very brief account of the history since 1947 would have actually highlighted our entire approach to the world order as such, which, as we are aware, is a dynamic entity. But for shortage of time, I would only say that from my angle, I would look at two prime issues in the pre-91 period, which actually, or I would say around the 91 period and prior to that, which actually focus on which the Indian foreign policy focused to a great extent. Number one was that it perceived a leadership role for itself in the developing world, something which is coming to the fore once again when we are looking at the global south and the support that India is offering to the global south even today. And the second was growth, which became a part of national policy and cooperation with the Western world, commenced based upon that around 1991 progressively and beyond. The cusp period of the 90s and did pose challenges against change. For example, during the first Gulf War, we ardently continued to support Saddam Hussein, yet we also allowed US aircraft refueling facilities in the Indian mainland. So defining national interest became an intensely challenging exercise, and that somehow always is something which confronts us. Although a new world order was to have arrived after the Cold War, it remained in evolution and never really cemented itself. A few factors which characterized the approach that we had during this period is something that I will go into now. India subscribed to and opened itself to becoming a member of multinational security efforts through virtual alliances, although it vehemently denied that these were alliances because we continue to follow the philosophy of non-alliance for fairly long, something which we continue to follow even today, actually. A quasi-aligned against a non-aligned status was considered to be in our national interest. India, US, Japan triangle, for example. The New World Order in the 90s sought a bipolar arrangement. The US and the EU, considered a single pole, were all powerful, but the rump power of Russia was insufficient to merit a pole position. China was economically rising, but its strategic outlook was yet of a much lower order. India's interests lay in aligning with all. So multilateralism became the philosophy which India followed and which probably continues to follow even today. A boost to its international image followed due to this particular approach. And today, India has refined that further with its higher strategic weight that it has acquired in international politics. It's a member of the SCO, for example, with both China and Russia, and equally remains a significant part of the Quad with the United States, Australia, and Japan. Straddling this strategic divide is never easy, but I think the last couple of years, India is probably succeeding in doing this with much aplomb. The tendency among the Indian strategic community to weigh the Indo-US strategic partnership in black and white terms when it comes to the existing and progressive state of US-Pak relations in particular is something that will need to be overcome in order to maintain continuity in our Indo-US strategic relationship, a very, very important relationship, as we are all aware. There will be mutual differences and disagreements between us and the players, which must be made irrelevant when it comes to the bigger international picture. So it's the neighborhood which has actually caused and continues to cause us concern. Our narrative must clearly accord priority here and already appears to be underway. The support and assistance to Sri Lanka, for example, that we have accorded off late is a case in point and probably will extend to other players within the subcontinent too. Three issues which need clarity in the current Indian narrative relate to its policy on Ukraine, its China policy, and lastly, our rising ambition of making a mark in the field of soft power, the Vishwaguru concept as such, to enhance our stature in the community of nations. Looking at the Ukraine-Russia war, for example, India has correctly demonstrated that it would pursue its own interests, was steadfastly defended and described by the Honorable Minister of External Affairs. Charting a middle path without being condemnatory or critical of Ukraine or NATO, and without issuing statements in support of Russia, has been a well thought through Indian narrative which exemplifies the pursuance of strategic autonomy for best national interest. This neutrality steps on no toes, and the moral ascendancy here is the fact that India still buys much less energy from Russia than Europe does. Prime Minister Modi's advice to President Putin at the SCO summit perhaps sets the stage for the future Indian mediation role, not only in this conflict, but perhaps in other conflicts. This is just perhaps the beginning. We should seek openings in this domain, the domain of not intervention, but not being referees in a dispute, but essentially those who are one which is going to resolve the dispute. We should seek openings in this domain as it serves our interest, projects India as a potential arbitrator of disputes, adds to the value of quasi-soft power, and clears the path perhaps for the membership, which we always look at, the membership of the UN Security Council. On China, China may or may not rise to a level where it could attempt to achieve its aspirations. Yet India has to be prepared for military confrontation and diplomatic balancing through alignments and linkages. India's presence among China's detractors irks China, but the Indian step is essentially a safeguard for its own interests. Since a complete trust deficit exists with China, safeguards for the midterm, that I would put that till the year around 2035 or so, need to be built without any hesitation. This should be our narrative. It is up to China to repair its relationship and restore whatever trust there exists. Coming to the last point, the issue of our power projection through the route of soft power. Having transcended to G20 and honored by the leadership bestowed on India, we must show this leadership in areas which are hitherto less focused upon. The experience in handling the pandemic, the vaccination rollout experience, self-reliance, manufacturing and services, climate-related issues, disaster management initiatives, such as the Prime Minister's 10-point program, which is yet not sufficiently known internationally. Education, research and development, clean energy, food and supplies, etc., are all awaiting the Indian touch and the Indian initiative. G20 could not have come at a better time, a time when India is readying itself for takeoff in areas that the world will be beset in handling in the near future. My last point, disputes and conflicts. India, it is important to learn, has to remember that it is important to learn to live with certain disputes which may not be resolved for elongated periods. Our narratives must proactively justify our stance through careful cultivation of our point of view, which must be morally and factually superior. The J&K issue and the LAC problem with China are more than just military conflict situations, and our narratives must gel with important international affairs. Although there are many more issues to cover, the outreach to the Indian diaspora is one issue which has been transformational as far as this government is concerned and helped establish a footprint of respect for the Indian community. The recent initiative of outreach to the global south is another reminder of a domain where India can make a huge mark in its international footprint. With my time over, I think I will stop here, although there would be much more to say, but if there is something in the discussion, then we'll be perhaps comment upon it at that time. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, General. You really touched upon many critical issues and a broad sweep of history. And I'm sure we can revert to some of these issues in the discussion. But thank you for also bringing out the concept of quasi-alignment. I find that quite interesting. Thank you so much. So I would now request General Khandare, please, if you could kindly share your views with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj, and thanks to General Hasnain for setting the stage as always. And I will try to ensure that I do not repeat what he has said, although most of the points, or rather all the points which he has said, are obviously very important. But constraint of time, I will avoid that. I have picked up specific lines which have been mentioned in the paper sent to us. That is the changing nature of India's foreign policy of reacting to global initiatives to set the narrative. That's what Pankaj, you also said in the beginning. And more important is shift of the strategical approach, wherein India, both as a maritime and continental power, is shaping its role as a global power beyond its existing region. Now, let me specifically mention that we talk of comprehensive national power and comprehensive national security, and power comes with one dimension of security involved in it. Where do we look at India setting its narrative? You know, what we are doing, can we improve upon it? Can we do it better? Let's take, for example, how do we influence the global decision makers? So we have a unique capability that our foreign policy is displaying. We're engaging with US, we are engaging with Russia, we are engaging with Iran, we are engaging with Israel. So that is something which is unique, a very dynamic foreign policy. Foreign policy, when supported by a strong military, is where we will establish our mark all over the world. Now, how do we look at it? See what we have done in the past. Can we improve upon it? The current president of Nigeria is a person who was trained in India in 1973. If we start looking at the alumni, you will find a large number of them are in decision-making positions. So our outreach to them has to improve. And by doing so, we will make a difference, whether it is in say Nigeria, where the president and the NSA both are alumni of the Indian military institution. I do not want to mention many more of these, but our training teams, our contribution of training those people here makes a lot of difference. You are targeting the mind. You are setting the mind in a position where they become long-standing friends of India, and whatever decisions are taken in those countries have definitely an influence from the Indian thought process. Whether our thought process is purely military, no, it is civilizational, it is based on our strategic approach, it is based on our unique stand of looking at national interest and the good of humanity. Specific case, Quad versus Sagar. The Prime Minister was very clear about Sagar, and that is what influences the people who rub shoulders with us, whether it is in our visits, whether it is in our training, whether it is in various opportunities that we have. So I think the human resource factor would be extremely important for setting the narrative. In any case, when you set the narrative, you are basically trying to influence the mind. So your decisions have to be based on creating a receptive ecosystem abroad, and look at how we are engaging the militaries. We are doing exercises with the United States. We are doing exercises with China also. So while we keep balancing this and we go beyond our reach, where we are not restricting ourselves only to the immediate neighborhood, but maybe even to the extended neighborhood. In the DEF Expo in October, we had the entire lot of defense ministers in Gandhinagar who were interacting with our defense minister from Africa as well as from the Indian Ocean region. You're setting the narrative right. So while at the level of the foreign ministry or the external affairs ministry, the line is decided, but we are the people who propagate. To that extent, my earnest appeal is that our footprint in a very peaceful manner should increase. Now, how does that happen? We have about 44 defense attaches abroad, covering about 77 countries with accreditation and physical presence. I think we need to go beyond that and propagate the strategic narrative at a much faster pace. Our training teams have to reach out much more. We have already amended the charter of the defense attaches. We have empowered them, which means when we start supplying the defense products, there is a lot of interaction again, and there is a lot of similarity of thought process which can be propagated. It also acts as signaling. So from or a transformation from being an importer, we are now becoming an exporter. And by being an exporter, you are increasing your own Atmanirbharta. At the same time, you are engaging deeply with other countries who want an option other than the current defense suppliers. Whether it is USA, whether it is Russia, whether it is China or Israel, you are pitching in. It's a long way to go, but we need to do that better. You look at our presence in the United Nations. We have decided at an optimum level, and our optimum level is based on troops can we spare, how many officers can we spare. We've done well there also, but I think we could look at it more and do something more. And here is the point which a lot of African nations where most of the peacekeeping missions have happened, they opine that whenever there is a crisis of global nature, it is the superpowers who shy away and countries like India chip in. You look at how it happened in peacekeeping, and now the recent one about COVID. When others shied away, India was leading. There also, we can look at the rising expectations to protect humanity from chemical and biological issues. So that is one more field where we can set the narrative. The other issue is we spoke only of the continental and maritime in the paper that has been given to us. I want to extend that to cyber. I want to extend that to space. This is one more area where we can become powerful. We can set the narrative to say that we are not a poor man's choice, but we are an affordable choice. So that is something that we can definitely, and we have done it. It's not that we haven't done it, but we can do much more. In any case, cyber is the new hegemon where people will attack deniability is there, non-attributability is there. So I think more important now is to get into allowing countries to interact with us, reaching out and getting their cyber insulated from the crime that is increasing. Any country which feels that its economy is going to shatter or its internal cohesion is going to shatter through cyberspace or infospace, I think India is a good choice to reach out and help them. Outer space is one more area. In our diplomacy, we need to go out much more. And to do that, firstly, I think we have to strengthen our fundamentals, our roots here. We possibly are only looking at a few aspects of outer space capability, but I think land, aerospace, maritime, outer space, cyberspace, and many more such domains are the ones where we can silently keep getting more populated with domain experts and set our narrative right. I think these are the few points that I wanted to cover more during the question answer session. Thank you, Pankaj.
Thank you so much, Vinod. That's an excellent presentation. You really focused on the hard aspects of narrative building, including targeting of the mind and the footprint and the expansion of the domains beyond maritime and continental. So thank you so much for all your insights. May I now request Mr. Zorawar Daulet Singh to please come in and share his views. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. Thank you to the ICWA for organizing this fabulous timely event. So, in my remarks, I'm going to sort of step back and look at the idea of geopolitics and possibly how we should think about a framework for this multipolar world that's coming to being. For the last decade, we have seen India's foreign policy, which has shown the ability to navigate a complex and turbulent world and leverage where possible geopolitical and geoeconomic advantages from the changing order. But yet I feel it is becoming imperative to conceive of a geopolitical framework to avoid becoming overly transactional or getting swayed by the fads of the season. I think it's also necessary for Indian public diplomacy to have an underlying template or even a broad vision of the world. So I think, in order to do this, and this is of course an incomplete sort of a first cut at this, is we need to sort of look back at some of our historical legacies, which are mixed. I'm going even to the British period. So it seems, in my understanding, that our foreign policy thought has been influenced by two key geopolitical approaches. One is the British Indian colonial era geopolitics, and then the Cold War era geopolitics, which came with the onset of Indian independence. So what was British Indian geopolitics about? We are somewhat familiar with it, but it's important to sort of re-emphasize the ideas that it brought about. British Indian grand strategy was aimed to project power across Asia using India as that hub or the central sort of bridgehead. It also isolated India from other centers of wealth and power. It eventually severed India's extensive pre-colonial geo-economic and geo-cultural connections with the wider surrounding regions. We also recall the image of the Great Game, where India was the prize to be secured in the great power rivalry between Britain and Russia. In fact, almost all British Indian continental military interventions, such as in Tibet, in the early part of the last century, or Afghanistan in the late 19th century, were all in some way or the other linked to the Anglo-Russian relationship. It was that period that also gave us this binary or this image of the maritime versus the continental, where geographers like Halford Mackinder gave expression to a rationale to British grand strategy, where the continental Eurasian heartland was seen as the main arena to contain and, when possible, confront. Of course, we see many of these patterns playing out in Western grand strategy today. For India, the unusual role it came to play in the era of British preponderance did or might have given the illusion of a natural Indian primacy in the Asian environment, and perhaps a bias towards a system of spheres of influence, with, of course, the British Indian one being the largest one in Asia at the time. But if we honestly look back, that was an aberration in a longer span of history. In its natural state, Asia and Eurasia were always a far more complicated area. It was a more plural and interconnected world than the era when British India towered over the rest. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because even in recent decades, consciously or subconsciously, Indian geopolitical thought is still influenced by some of that colonial era geopolitics, which I can return to later. The second theme or influence for India's foreign policy came after 1947 and the Cold War period. We will recall that Indian independence was accompanied by two major historical events. One was a traumatic shock on our periphery, the division of the subcontinent, which in a sense negated Indian power, which had had this sort of at least not a threat within this sub-region. We also saw a global disruption with the outbreak of the superpower rivalry between the US and the Soviets. This phase saw new geopolitical concepts, some ironically reinforcing British era thought. Nicholas Spikeman, a US geostrategist, outlined a sequel to the Mackinder framework by suggesting a map of the world that was again divided between the continental heartland of Eurasia and the maritime rimland regions on the periphery. The latter regions being areas for power projection by the West and establishment of political, economic, and military footholds. Soviet containment at the time required these rimland regions to fall under the sway of what was called a collective alliance system of security. On this equation, with pressures to sort of align with the superpower blocs, independent India chose a geopolitical framework. Our objective at the time was very straightforward: safeguarding the newly secured sovereignty that this nation state had acquired after an intense period of opposition to colonial rule. And it was felt that this could be undermined by participation, particularly military participation in the Cold War. So this was the concept behind the context behind the articulation of non-alignment. At the time, India rejected the idea that there were only two options available. There was a third area of the world order in Indian map of the world. This was this post-colonial group, which today we call the Global South. But it is important to remember that the intention was never to lead a third bloc, much less to solve the internal problems of the non-aligned world. It was primarily to provide a legitimate geopolitical identity to states that were seeking a separate way and a disassociation from the Cold War. So we now come to how do we manage or think about a geopolitical framework. I'm certainly not offering one here, but I can sort of attempt to outline some of the features on what that might entail. So one thing is becoming quite clear, that if the global and regional setting has changed, and it has changed quite dramatically in the past decade, both from the period after post-1991, but also there have been changes for the world order that existed between 45 and 89 or 45 and 91. So there has been a temptation in some quarters to grasp at British era concepts and sort of reinvent some sort of a frontline role for India as a net security provider in the contemporary era. My submission is that that particular template is no longer viable, both from a balance of power reality and also our national interests. So then we look at the Cold War era and the kind of ideas that we could rely on there. Now there, the situation gets a bit more complex and interesting, because Indian agency did exist during that period, and we did make certain geopolitical choices, which, if we retrospectively look back, did provide some security. But at the same time, the balance of power and the complex interlinks between the major powers today might not allow for a conventional non-aligned strategy to be playing out in practice and offer the kind of geoeconomic and security advantages that we seek for ourselves. From this idea of Mackinder and Spikeman, the continental and the maritime, we should remember that these maps of the world that were offered by these Western strategists were ultimately from the perspective of a maritime great power looking at the Eurasian supercontinent and its maritime littoral regions, of which South Asia was one of them. But it was looking from the outside in. Are these maps of the world or these concepts relevant for India? What are the characteristics of India's geopolitical environment? So, and here I think it's important to recognize, both from an identity perspective and our location, we are at the crossroads of different sub-regions, different civilizations, and also different security complexes that are in our surrounding areas. Not all these security complexes, whether in East Asia or West Asia, require an extra-regional role for India. Certainly not a military strategic role. Part of the reason why India gets offered different political security roles and pulled in different directions, and we've seen this again in the recent decade, is I think we have an insufficiently developed school of Indian geopolitics that is not yet consciously fused what I would suggest that we have our three international identities today. The first is the post-colonial identity of strategic independence, strategic autonomy, whatever nomenclature you want to use it, the idea that India is an independent actor. The second, which is now coming to the fore, that India also has even a deeper identity as a larger civilizational, geocultural, geopolitical center, which predates anything that's happened in the last couple of centuries. And then, of course, we have a more contemporary identity, a major power aspiration. We call it our manifest destiny, so to speak, to become a future pole in a plural multipolar setting. When you combine these identities together, you will arrive at a map of the world which is very different from Mackinder or Spikeman or what's on offer in the contemporary sort of frameworks out there. I'll just close by making two final points on very briefly on what this geopolitical concept should also accommodate for. I think the multipolar world that is coming into being still has not ruled out the possibilities for collaboration, for interdependence. Globalization will still continue to play an important role, of course, in a modified form, in a reformed form. How does our geopolitical framework accommodate for those kinds of partnerships, issue-based partnerships that we are seeking to develop? I would suggest that this concept should be less imbued with ideology and more identifiable with social and material interests, because that will empower India's foreign policy to pursue these kinds of issue-based partnerships and networks without getting boxed into an all-encompassing ideological straitjacket that we've seen is certainly for other states entrapping them in bloc-based politics. Finally, from the idea of even a basic self-interest, India's foreign policy is always sought to reform and transform world order. So again, we're looking at a geopolitical concept that is going to transcend geography, transcend this region, and look at the world system as a whole. So, because if we're going to even have incremental change, we are going to have to develop collaborative networks and new multilateral institutions that can make those changes in either issues or regions. So I'll just close there, Chair, and hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Zorawar. I think this is an outstanding presentation, extremely insightful, and your reference to developing an Indian school of geopolitics, I think really that goes to the heart of the matter, and that sums up pretty much the task at hand. So thank you so much to you and to also General Hasnain and General Khandare for this very, very insightful presentation of the topic. So now we have some time for Q&A, and I see that there are some questions on the chat box. I don't know how ICCR would like us to proceed, but Dhrubajyoti, do you have any guidance for us, or can we just go forward?
So I can read out the questions for you.
Yeah, that'll be nice. Thank you.
Please.
Okay. Let me just go to the questions. The first question, it's to the panel, open to all the panel. How India balances its regional and geographical interests and conflicts with its international and with its international and institutional conflicts and interests using strategic autonomy, or how India addresses some existing conflicts between regional interests and the position it seeks in international arena. And there's one specific question to Lieutenant General Vinod sir. Sir, your question is, since you mentioned about Sagarmala vision of India, how India will become a relative gainer as well as a balanced external power in the Indo-Pacific region? Also, with reference to the Chinese BRI project and its strings of pearl strategy, what are the current stance on India, and how India would respond to the AUKUS alliance? Can it be considered as a balance to the Chinese expansion policies?
That's great. So maybe on the first question of how do you balance local and regional interests with your international interests, maybe I'll ask Zorawar if you want to comment on that, or any other speaker briefly, and then we go to the other questions.
Like me go first? Okay.
Yes, please do that.
Okay. So I think what I've understood is how do you accommodate India's strategic autonomy with your other relationships? Is that what's being asked? I think the idea of strategic autonomy or independence is taken as given, right? So what's happening next is we are building these multiple partnerships with multiple power centers. Why are we doing that? We're doing that to firstly advance our domestic development. We are advancing our military modernization. So clearly material social goals or objectives are linked to that. We are not building these partnerships to enable these major powers to advance their security goals. So, which of course they would like us to do, right? So there's this tension between when India builds its strategic partnerships with the major powers and when they seek to build partnerships with India. So that tension is inherent in any power or rising power like India that seeks strategic autonomy or independence. Because if you do not, then of course you've got to line up like what we're seeing in Western Europe and East Asia. And that's certainly a choice out there. You can line up and become a junior partner in a collective alliance security system. But that's something which Indian policymakers, right from the very beginning, have rejected. And there have been few instances where they've been forced to undertake security partnerships, but those were intense pressures when they were being surrounded, or another great power was out to sort of confront you on your core interests. And that option still remains. Nobody's saying you can't team up with another great power if another great power is coming to get you. But on the whole, our strategic autonomy, I think, empowers us, and it's the fundamental basis to emerge as a future great power. You give that up now, then you're going to be left with a secondary status. And I think we've seen in previous centuries what that status entails, right? You're serving another major power. That's why I alluded to the British-Indian phase. On surface, it gave the illusion of Indian supremacy or primacy in this Indian Ocean, but it was backed or serving a different great power political economy. I think that's very important to recognize even today, because we do have voices inadvertently advocate those kinds of grand strategies. And I think if we are conscious, then we will not go down that path again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is a question which I would request General Vinod Khandare, if you
May I come in for a very
Sure.
brief period on the last question?
Yeah.
I think there are two issues here, and I would look at the two disputes that we really have, in which are sort of political-military disputes, both of them, with China and with Pakistan. Now, with Pakistan in particular, we have the Shimla Agreement of 1972, which we want to pursue through bilateralism, which is what is laid down in the Shimla Agreement, and that's something which Pakistan does not want to pursue. And we find that this is one domain in which there is an apparent lack of clarity in our foreign policy. You see, we find Pakistan attempting to take us to the cleaners every year in the month of August, September in the United Nations, elsewhere. You go internationally to any seminar, anywhere, you will find a Pakistani presence always attempting to take India apart, while the spirit of bilateralism is never followed. And we do not insist on our strategic autonomy should ensure that we insist on this whole business of bilateralism and also encourage, cultivate major players around the world not to accept narratives other than the narratives which have been set out in agreements between us and Pakistan. This is something I think with which we need to pursue it a little more ardently. With China, yes, we have got disputes over a period of time, military disputes, boundary disputes, etc. We have attempted to safeguard ourselves through a series of political military not alliances, quasi alliances, as I was talking about, agreements, acceptances, and things like that. That I think is the right approach which we are following. While following a strategic autonomy, not being sort of forced into any of our decision makings, our orientation is always there with mutual interest with the countries who are supporting us. The recent example of the Pakistan issue, on the Kashmir issue, for example, stands out very blatantly in the recent past, when you find that a perfectly well considered narrative which was going on, which India was acting as a virtual neutral, you suddenly find the United States using Kashmir, using Pakistan with efforts to try and pressurize us. Now, this is the classic place where we need to ensure that such disputes of ours remain just bilateral disputes and do not transcend into the international environment.
Yeah, well, that's actually well said. So I'll just now turn to General Khandare and request him if he has any observations on this particular issue, which both speakers have mentioned, or would you like to jump straight to the other questions about the Sagar Mala and military diplomacy?
Pankaj, I'll go to the next part so that we can gain more out of it. And specifically, the questions which were given out were regarding the Sagar vision. Sagar vision, which was clearly enunciated by our Honorable Prime Minister. And that brings out very clearly what Pankaj, you had started by saying our national goals. What are our national goals? Our national goals are to ensure the area is kept peaceful. We don't want to unnecessarily get into any conflict unnecessarily. And if we have to, it will be our choice. If we will not be driven into it by any organization or any alliance. So to that extent, we expect this entire region to grow peacefully. Our engagement with countries from East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, to those of the African Rim countries, we all want to grow because there is much more to do than to get into a military duel. So that is where the thing is very clear. We have to develop our blue economy. We have to grow. We have to guard our maritime economical interest as well as the security interest. So to do that, while we keep the option open for Quad, but not as a military alliance, and we also take advantage of Quad as something which is still dynamic, which is still keeping our adversary a little confused to that extent. AUKUS is very purely and something between these countries related to a military alliance, so to say, because of the hardware, military hardware that has been spoken of right in the beginning itself. We are not a part of that, but we are quite clear we have to guard our maritime interests using our naval power. We will develop our naval power using other friends also. And that is where when we say, the Prime Minister said, Viksit Desh, we have to develop. So which means we have to develop as peacefully as possible without compromising on sovereignty. To do that, we have to keep our economic interests primarily in front. China BRI, that is something while it was announced by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan, But actually speaking, the blueprint was already forming in the 90s in Africa. General Hasnain has been there. I have been there in Africa. We know exactly how it was unfolding in a manner without a formal announcement, because Deng Xiaoping had said hide and bite. So they were following that particular policy. Now, how does it put us? On one flank, you have the CPEC, which is the flagship. On the other flank, we could have the Myanmar, China-Myanmar economic corridor. So obviously, there is something where our regional neighbors are being engaged more intensively by China using the economic power, which is how they have always viewed to become a regional as well as an international player. What is our response to that? I'm not going into what is available in open domain. Everyone knows what we are doing, North-South transit corridor and other things. What is extremely important is get our economy moving fast. And the moment we become strong, then you can do much more. Today, there is a tremendous differential, economic, technological, and military differential between us and China. So just blindly, we don't need to get into any competition. But that doesn't mean we be submissive. So our strategy is again going to create similar, not problems, but challenges by engaging more intensively with the neighbors in the periphery of China and get into some economic relationship, and also very peacefully in the security relationship in the various domains which I mentioned.
Thank you, Vinod, for this replying to the questions. I believe we might have run into extra time, so I will just quickly. Well, it's actually quite difficult to summarize this discussion or this topic because it is so diverse and complicated. But clearly, we have challenges of a real nature when it comes to our immediate periphery, whether China, Pakistan, or terror or Kashmir, which has been brought out. But at the same time, we have the bigger picture on the global scale. And there, the whole issue of whether India should or does or ought to have a grand strategy is very, very important, and also, I think, relevant to how we shape our future responses to some thing which is so difficult to put your finger on in terms of the entire international landscape and the shifting sands in the world. So thank you very much once again to the speakers, and I, my own behalf, would like to thank ICWA for inviting me and the rest of us for this discussion. Obviously, it requires far more in-depth analysis of where India should be headed. But clearly, I think the consensus among all of us in the panel is that the Indian approach to what is going on in the world has changed. It has become more ambitious, and there is a sense within India that we not only are capable of raising our game, so to say, on the global stage, but that the time has come for us to do it, and we will see more of it as we go along in the future, even as we deal with the challenges posed from our immediate neighborhood, which have also been discussed in this discussion. So maybe I will stop here, and with this, perhaps we could end the discussion. I hand the floor over to ICWA, once again thanking them for this opportunity.
Thank you, Chair. With this, we come with the end of the fifth session. Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for chairing the session. I will also thank Lieutenant General Hasnain, Lieutenant General Khandare, and Zorawar Daulet Singh for expressing their views and experience. With this, we come to the end of the fifth session.